Hey everybody, it's Rich from Stickies RC, and we are back talking about suspension. We're talking about shocks, we're talking about springs, we're talking about shock positions today. You're going to hear things like Hooke's Law and alpha angles, all of that kind of fun stuff. Now, if it's a little bit noisy in the background, that's because I'm running a fan full blast here in the studio because it's freaking hot. Hot and humid. Air is so thick here you gotta chop through it with a machete like you're going through the rainforest. It's so hot and humid here. But anyhow, today we're gonna get into really about shock position and how it affects how your rig works, your ride height, how spring rates work, and that's where Hooke's Law will come into play. Alpha angle, that's the angle at which your shock is positioned at. We're going to get into all of that today. So let's head on over to the bench and check out some stuff on the rig. Before we get into all of that, I want to say thank you to everyone that has subscribed to the channel, tunes in every week, and checks out the videos. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please go down, hit that subscribe button, hit that bell button, also so that you get notified when I get new videos out. Also, be sure you go down into the description and check out all the links for all the stuff I use to make my videos. Again, thank you all so much for the support. I really appreciate it. Before we get into checking out shock position, I'm going to talk about spring rates and coil springs specifically. So, a coil spring adheres to something called Hooke's Law. And Hooke's Law is that as a coil spring is compressed, it increases its spring rate. So if you take a spring and you squash it down, it will be emitting more resistance than it is at the beginning of you squashing it. So as you press a spring together, it gets harder and harder and harder until you eventually bottom the spring out. Now, how this reacts and how your truck reacts when you're compressing a spring can greatly affect how your rig is handling. And that is something that's very important to remember when you're making adjustments to shock position, because a shock position can change how much travel the shock is actually going through, which may make your spring rate more consistent or more linear rather than a more progressive angle. Now, if you're only compressing your shocks very little, but you're getting a lot of travel in your suspension, you're effectively keeping a very linear spring rate. If you have a shock that's more straight up and down, and the shock is traveling more, you're getting a more progressive spring rate. So as that suspension gets squashed down, it's going to be trying to spring back even harder. So there's a couple of ways that you can combat a progressive spring rate and how you position the shocks in your rig in order to keep from possibly getting to where your truck gets too springy when the suspension is fully compressed. So that being said, now we can get over to the bench and start talking about shock positions. Okay, we are here at the bench and we're taking a look at my belly dragger suspension, and what I've done is I've tilted my front shock up a little bit and I've tilted my rear shock down a little bit from where I typically run it to show sort of an exaggerated view of what happens when you change the alpha angle in your rig. So taking a look at the front, the angle of the shock is more vertical, and what that is doing is that is giving me a more progressive compression of my spring because I'm actually bottoming the shock out. So now if I were to take and lean that shock over, say like I have in the rear, you can see that I've given myself a little bit more articulation because I'm not limiting the amount of travel by simply the length of the shock, but I'm also not bottoming out the shock and not compressing the spring all the way. Therefore, I'm not getting the full effect of Hooke's law out of my spring. And that's going to allow me to have less pressure pushing my axles back down towards the ground. Now, since this rig doesn't have a lot of weight up top, and it is predominantly very, very bottom heavy and a very, very low center of gravity, this works out to my advantage. This also, tilting the shocks, also allows me to get a more full range of travel out of my suspension. As you can see here, my shock doesn't limit where it stops the axle. The axle is actually being limited because it's hitting the cross brace on the chassis. Whereas in the front, you can see the front axle is actually being limited because the shock is bottoming itself out. Now, if I tilt this over, I will get more travel until what happens is the panhard bar actually hits the side of the chassis. That's as much chassis suspension movement as I'm going to be able to get, short of making a reverse bend panhard bar, which doesn't work, because if I make a reverse bend panhard bar, then as you can see, it would hit the top of the axle. The reason why the panhard bar is bent is so that it doesn't hit the axle. So there's always going to be a little bit of compromise here or there when you're setting up your suspension for more of a performance driven or low center of gravity style setup. Now let's say that what I've done here doesn't work. Maybe the suspension is too soft and my rear end is sagging down all the time, and I'm transferring the weight from the front of my rig to the rear of my rig by doing that. Well, essentially what I can do is I can move this shock position back a hole or two, which is going to raise that suspension back up. Now it is going to increase or decrease my alpha angle and make the shock sit more straight up and down, but if your truck is sitting butt down when it's going up a hill, that means that the front end is going to want to pull away from the climb and fall over backwards. So ultimately what I'm trying to do is keep my rig as flat and steady as possible and as low to the ground as possible. That's going to give me the optimum performance out of my rig. One of the things that also is an advantage to being able to move your shock positions around is raising and lowering of your ride height. Now, essentially what happens is you're not changing the length or distance between these 2 points, but what you're doing is you're changing where this point below is in relation to the chassis. So as you tilt the shock over, your suspension is going to move up, and thus lowering your rig down. A more vertical is going to do the opposite. The steeper the angle it is, if you change nothing in the shocks, the higher your truck's going to go. So that is something that comes in very, very handy if you want to adjust the ride height of your vehicle without making adjustments to the actual spring preloads on your shocks. For the most part, when you adjust the spring preload screw on your shocks, when the shock is at full extension and the spring is still being compressed, you are therefore creating a bit of spring preload. And with Hooke's law, you know, as that spring is more compressed, it's going to get more rigid. So as you screw the preload screw up and compress the spring more, you're essentially making the spring start out at a more rigid point in its travel. Now, if you unscrew the preload until the spring is not being compressed, then you have essentially relaxed the spring completely and allowing it to rest in its normal position. Typically, this is how I run most of my shocks. I usually will not put much preload, and what I will generally do is just simply screw the preload screw down until the spring is completely captured when the shocks and the suspension is all the way at its bottom. Hey guys, just wanted to remind you all about Operation 11 Charlie. Now, if you're new to the channel, or if you haven't heard about Operation 11 Charlie, we are a full 501c3 nonprofit organization that supports our veterans who suffer from PTSD. And how we do that is by introducing them to this amazing hobby and amazing community that we all belong to. So, head on over to o11c.org. That's our website. You can check us out there, read about what we're doing, read about how we're helping our veterans. Also, if you'd like, head on over and make a donation. And also, you can tune in every Monday night at 8 p.m. and check us out on our live stream on the 11 Charlie YouTube channel. And every other Wednesdays, you can check us out in our Facebook group where we do a live Q&A. Thank you all very much for the support, and thank you to all of our veterans for their service. Now, with changing the shock positions at the top, this can have a great impact on the ride height of your truck and also in its performance. So this is something, again, that according to your driving style, you're going to want to make these changes and make small changes, usually 1 or 2 holes at a time, and then go out and test and see how those changes have affected your vehicle. Once you find a spot that you feel is optimum, continue to go in the same direction and change the shock position to see if you can go too far and affect this performance of your rig in a negative way. Then you know you can move it back to the position where you found its optimum performance. You never know what a rig's optimum performance on true limits are unless you go beyond the limits and then come back to be just short of hitting the line where you go over the limit. Let's say you're building a scale rig and you don't want to change the position of your shocks at the top because that isn't going to look real. Well, what can I do in order to change the performance of my shocks? Well, talked about it in the first video, oil and springs. So one of the things that you can do to calculate the spring that you need is weigh your unsprung weight. So here's an explanation of unsprung and sprung weight. Unsprung weight is everything that is mounted basically or attached to the bottom of the shocks. And this means that the shocks and the springs are not supporting those pieces. Sprung weight is everything that is mounted or attached at the top of the springs and shocks. So that means that the shocks and the springs are carrying that weight. So generally what you have is your chassis, your transmission, your motor, your battery, your body, basically everything that sits on the frame of the truck is sprung weight. So here's what you're going to do. You're going to get the weight of all the stuff you have sitting up on top of the spring or your sprung weight. And you can look around and see if the shock manufacturer that you have, in this case I have SSD, actually gives you the load rating for your springs, and you can try and hit that specifically. Say you have 5 pounds of body and everything up here, and you find yourself some 1.15 pound springs. That's probably going to be pretty close to what you're looking for. What you'll want to do at that point is then put everything together, take your rig out, drive it around, see if it's working and giving that scale body roll that you want. And if it's not, say it's rolling too much, then your spring is slightly too soft. And going from the 1.15, maybe you need to jump up to a 1.25 or maybe even a 1.75. Now, if you go up a spring and it's too stiff and the truck is sort of bouncing and not riding the way you want it to, then you have to find something in between. Now, a lot of shock manufacturers don't give you that in-depth of information. I know a lot of the racers, like the Low-Cs and the Technos and Associated, they give very precise information about all of their springs because racers are very, very picky about their suspension. And they also want to have as much knowledge as possible about their suspension so they can document it and make it repeatable. In the case of scale and trail trucks, well, things aren't quite that precise. And a lot of times what you'll find is shock manufacturers will just simply give you a soft, a medium, and a hard. And in between different shock manufacturers, they may not be the same spring rates. So the good thing is, if you find that the medium spring is too soft and the hard spring is too hard from one particular manufacturer, you can go out and find other shock manufacturers' springs and try them until you hit that sweet spot. Again, with scale rigs, because there's a lot of customizing that you have to do, a lot of things when it comes to suspension tuning is trial and error. Now, let's say you're building not a specific comp rig and you're not building a super duper scale rig, but you still want your trail rig to look pretty good and also to work pretty good. You have a few options for being able to modify your suspension, things like shock keys. You can go to companies like IERC, Rock Pirates RC, Scale Metal Supplies, and places like that where they make shock keys, and a lot of them make shock keys specifically for the vehicle you have. Also, the same companies, most of them, make multi-position shock towers that will replace the shock towers that are on your existing rig. For instance, you have a rig that the shock towers don't have any optional positions for mounting. Like, for instance, the Vanquish shock towers for the VS410 have only one shock position. Well, you can easily go out and purchase a shock tower that are reasonably priced or a shock key and mount it up to your chassis and be able to move your shock position around as I had shown before. As I said in the first video, shock tuning, suspension tuning is something that is very, very subjective. And it is something that requires a lot of time and effort in order for you to learn and also to be able to get something set up exactly the way you want it. What I've given you are simple steps and simple things that you can do in order to change the performance of your rig and to tune your suspension so that you can find that perfect spot that you like the best. Thank you all very much for watching. I truly appreciate the support for the channel, and if you have any questions or anything, please post them down in the comments below, and I always read the comments and I always answer back. So again, thank you.